ahead. Let's go ahead and get started, and I'm going to let John take over. But before we do that, one request. I'm going to ask everybody to mute your audio. And there'll be a couple of ways you can do that. If you run your mouse onto your picture, you'll see a blue button that says mute. Go ahead and click on that to mute yourself so that we're not having any sound going on in the background. And then if you want to say something, unmute yourself and talk, or you can raise your hand and wave it like that and I'll unmute you and we can add you in there. But it's too confusing not having these muted because we're getting too many sounds on in the background. So at this point, I'm going to turn the presentation over to John. And I wanted to clarify one thing in the early video where we did the welcome to the convention. I had all of the officers and board members introduce themselves. John said, well, he was just nominated. Well, that isn't quite true. He is actually taking over. He filled out the term of another board member who left, and he's up for nomination for his own term now coming this year. So he is a true blue board member on his own right now, and hopefully he's going to be on for permanently with us at this point. So John, turning it over to you.
Thank you, Terry. Welcome, everybody. We only have a short amount of time, actually less than an hour. So I thought it would be better for our discussion if we tried to focus more specifically on parts of the novel, and maybe that will give everybody more of a chance to say something. So for me, the way to organize this, I think, is to look at the organization of the novel. And if you look at the novel, you realize that it very clearly divides into two distinct parts, almost neatly divided in the middle of the novel. The first part begins as if it's going to be a traditional Western. You've got the introduction of the bad guys and their nefarious plot. You've got the introduction of the hero, and the hero becomes determined to stop this gang of criminals from doing what they want to do. And then that part of the story gets immediately pushed into the far background, and the rest of that first part that goes for about 200 pages is concerned with the epic horseback ride over to the White Mountains and the sojourn in Paradise Park. And that part of the story, to me, seems to be a real digression from what we think of as the traditional Western. And so if I had to give that part of the story a title, I would call it The Education of Helen Raynor. And I say Helen Raynor, and of course, Bo is there, her sister is there too, and undergoing the same education. But the focus is on Helen. For one thing, we see that part of the story through Helen's eyes. It's a third person, limited point of view, limited to Helen. So we get that part of the story strictly through Helen's eyes, through what she sees and hears and experiences. And also we're privy to her mind. We share her thoughts and her emotions. So the education really is focused on Helen. So that's why I would call that part The Education of Helen Raynor. And then as we leave that part and move into part two of the novel, about the last couple of hundred pages roughly, it becomes more of a traditional Western with the mustache twirling villain trying to take over the helpless damsel's ranch, and her need for a hero or a group of heroes to save her from those dire consequences. So I'd like to talk first of all, first part of our discussion about the education of Helen Raynor at Paradise Park, and then we can move into the discussion of the more traditional Western part of the story in the second part of our discussion. So there are a lot of questions I have about the various aspects of Helen and Bo's education, but I'd like to jump to a really important point that I don't want us to miss. I want to jump into it first of all, and that is the idea that a very important part of Dale's curriculum, if you will, is the topic of atavism. I don't know if you're familiar with that term, atavism. It's ATAVISM. roughly speaking, it's the idea that is it possible for more advanced creatures on the evolutionary scale, is it possible for them to move backward and go back to a more primitive state of existence that they have evolved out of a long time ago? And that seems to me to be a very important subject. Gray never uses the term atavism, but that's really what Dale is talking about a lot of times in the story. So have I totally confused you? Can you see any parts of that part of the story where atavism is a major subject for Dale's teaching and for Helen's learning? Any thoughts on that from anybody?
I can share some perspective. I almost
All right.
think it's to a certain extent maybe the opposite. And you could look at Bo, and Bo was much more a throwback kind of a person. She's a young person. She's not really talking about the intellectual aspects of this. But then as her sister became more sophisticated and more educated, she became more civilized. I almost think that this is suggesting that as one matures, they might become more civilized and less adaptive to the primitive ways.
Yeah, that's basically the idea that evolution moves in that direction. But what does Dale argue to Helen specifically that she needs to do to become a complete person?
Well, it seems like, as I recall, that she had to do less thinking and just be more natural of what was going on. And when I look at this, and I almost think of looking at it as education of Dale, because just how he had to change or did change when he was with all the with Bo and Helen, of course. To me, just the aspect of Dale versus Helen, and maybe that's the wrong word, but seeing how they interact together and how both of them kind of educate to a middle. To me, that was just the fascinating part about that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. In fact, at one point in the story, Dale defines their two positions. He says, I am the natural man, you are the intellectual woman. And so you're right, there is that conflict.
May I just add another aspect of that? Because what I saw—
Somebody on?
Keith, can you turn your speaker up?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Because one aspect, and maybe this is kind of just an additional one, is that what I saw there was kind of a natural, almost a religion, as opposed to the more formal religious practices that Helen came with.
Mm-hmm.
And what I saw there is that there is a value in that kind of knowledge, and that to become a whole person, as someone had just mentioned, you need to not necessarily revert back, but acquire that natural knowledge and combine it with or integrate it with maybe the civilized knowledge that you have. Because Milt had, he was not an uneducated man. I mean, from a formal standpoint. So I see an effort to actually integrate those two, and you see the integration happen. I think, from my perspective, I saw it happen more with Helen than perhaps with Milt.
Yeah, good point. Other thoughts on that?
Yeah, there's one issue here that I think may have passed by for some people. There's even a suggestion that that the natural is not compatible with civilization. And it's a very small part, but look at what happened. See, the cougar's name was Tom, is that right?
Yeah.
Tom, right?
Mm-hmm.
At the end, Tom left. And Milt said he's never going to be back. Why was he never going to be back? I think it's because he couldn't tolerate civilization. And there's a certain point at which Milt moves close enough to Helen that he was no longer compatible with some of the things he loved in the wilderness.
Mhm. Yeah, you know, when you think about it, Dale, we think of as a man who is totally integrated into the natural environment. And yet he does things that seem to me to violate that natural environment, like taming a mountain lion. Uh, isn't that violating nature in a way? Taming a bear and a mountain lion?
I think it's embracing the
Embracing?
wilderness,
Yeah,
bringing it closer in.
Zen and I can you hear me now?
Yes.
Zen and I exchanged some emails in the past few days about this book. And I looked at this one, the one that John Tuska published in 2010. And there are 3 chapters in this that are not, that are in this. And those 3 chapters are the ones you're talking about right now. And Zen and I went back and forth on it. And my conclusion was, or theory, is that there was another edition of this too in The Country Gentleman. But in 1918, the World War I was in progress, and Zane Grey was pretty disappointed and dejected about World War I. And maybe he introduced these chapters in what he had originally written for Country Gentlemen, and which are not in this book, but they are the very chapters that you're talking about.
Yeah.
And that evolutionary thing. So it's kind of curious how he, made sure those chapters were in this version that we're reading right now.
Mm-hmm. And that's chapters 9 through 12, I believe.
Yeah.
And which is the core,
10, 11,
the
and
core
12.
philosophy of the book.
Yeah, 10, 11, and 12, but they're the chapters you're talking about right now.
Yeah.
And so it's possible that they weren't in the Country Gentleman series. And that's where he added them. But Zen and I came up with a conclusion that they were really Zane Grey's contribution, because he was, religion and evolution were big on his agenda.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, this is the philosophical core of the novel.
Right.
And I can imagine why he left it out for the popular magazine version.
Yeah. And John Tuska sort of had a different theory, which Zen and I don't agree with. But poor John Tuska is not alive now to defend himself. So.
And that introduction is in Dorn of the Mountains, is that right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, Dorn in the Mountains. It's
Is this supposedly the original manuscript? Dorn.
Pardon?
Is Dorn of the Mountains the original manuscript?
John Tuska says in the introduction to Dorn in the Mountain that manuscript is the one that's in the Library of Congress. And I checked, it's on the list in the Library of Congress. And on there, John Tuska says there was a note that Zane Grey had written, this is, his original writing. But his original writing when? It might have been earlier when he wrote the Country Gentleman articles. And then when World War I came along, he got more interested in this philosophical religious aspect. And maybe that's when he put it in. I don't know if we'll ever know, but Zen, what do you think?
Well, Ed and I may have a little bit of an edge here because we were able to work on something that Grey wrote sometime in the 1902 to 1910 or 11 period, in which he discussed religion, and having seen that, the 3 chapters that you're talking about do not surprise me at all. I think Grey was much more religious than we have heretofore given him credit for. And I think it was based on nature. I don't think it was pantheism, but I think it was that you can see, we all can see if we stop to think about it. And if we take our time, we can all see God in nature. We see it every day. We see it in the changing seasons. And Gray wrote so beautifully of the changing seasons and the effect that of the seasons on the trees and the flowers and the animals and that microevolution, if you want to call it that. I just think it was Gray's treatise on religion in Milt Dale.
Yeah, and let's, going back to Chuck Pfeiffer's book, boy, a lot of his book is on this topic. I mean, you can spend a lot of time looking at Chuck Pfeiffer's book on this topic, and I think you're right, 100%, Sam.
And one thing I would ask though is if this is Gray revealing his spirituality through Dale, does Dale's religion believe that it's necessary to have a supernatural being who runs nature?
Well,
he thinks it's necessary to believe there's a supernatural being in charge.
Milt talks of and I can't remember the line exactly, but in one of his soliloquies, Milt says, if there is a God, this is it.
Yeah, you're right. And I have it right here. He says, I have a religion, but it's not the kind you have, not the Bible kind. And then he goes on to talk about there's something unseen but always with me, and that's it. Call it God if you like.
Yes.
It seems to me that what he worships is the mechanism of nature. My view. Other thoughts?
No, well, I agree with that. I mean, I think that's the strong point. As far as I'm concerned, that part of the book, the religion part, is what drew me to it.
Mm-hmm.
As I read through it with my background, that drew me to Gray more than some of the others that I read before. I just think it's a beautiful. I think it's a beautiful section in there.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you. I think that this part of the book makes the book worth reading.
And I think that the girl brought that out of Milt when she questioned him and he began to explain why he believes and why he does what he does. He's doing that in response to her questions, whether they're verbal or nonverbal, and that's what brings those feelings out. And I can see that I think Milt is pretty smart. I don't think he's book smart, but I think he's pretty smart.
Oh yeah, I mean, he makes that clear. He's the natural man, but he's not
exactly.
stupid,
Yeah,
and Helen says that. Helen says that exact thing somewhere early on, that he's very smart, but not book smart.
And it's kind of interesting that the two women from civilization are willing to become students to this natural man.
One thing I'd like to add is that Zane Grey was very much a social Darwinist at a time when Darwin was kind of an elitist theory, and the religious people, a lot of them were opposed to him, still are. Actually. And so a lot of that discussion also was really about survival of the fittest. And interestingly, and this gets back a little bit to the discussion of the lion, Milt, to a certain extent, by taming that lion, made it less able to survive in the wilderness.
That's what I meant. Yeah, it was a violation of nature.
Yet he talked about survival of the fittest when he was talking about how the trees shelter one another and let the sunlight in and let certain trees grow and others die.
Yeah.
But he was doing things himself that were contrary to that concept. When you tame a wild animal, you make it less able to survive.
Yeah.
You make it less comparable. When you cut down trees for cabins, you're destroying certain things. And so and I think that probably reflects some inconsistency in Gray's own positions on activities.
Well, I wonder if Tom was really tamed. I'm not so sure Tom was tamed, and I'm not so sure Milt tamed him. I think they were maybe buddies that came to like one another, but I don't know that Tom was tamed. I wouldn't say he was tamed, and that's why he was able to go off when Milt ended up going to the town.
So Tom is actually an example of atavism. He had become civilized, but at one point he reverts to his earlier form of being, right?
Well,
I mean, that's atavism, isn't it?
He goes back to to solitary nature, but I'm not so sure that he was tamed to begin with. So
Yeah.
I'm not so sure he had to go very far back.
I think you're right. Yeah.
Yeah, one thing is, remember the movie we saw yesterday? Look at that cougar that was in that movie.
That's
I
not a
wonder how
cougar.
They managed
That's
those
an
things.
African lion.
It's not a cougar to begin with. It's a lion.
Well,
Yeah.
whatever it is, cougars.
They didn't have
and
any.
lions too.
They couldn't find any actual tame cougars who could act, so they had to use the
Maybe
mountain
Jim can
lion.
tell us
Okay.
how they did that
African
in the
lions.
movie.
I had to laugh at
Well-
that. And Jim, that's a question for you is,
Well, what you saw was Hollywood.
yeah.
Right.
And they find whatever they have that looks the part, and they pay a lot of money for trainers to come in and train, whether it's a cougar or a lion or a parakeet or a dog or a and don't mistake it. Don't leave the horses out of this civilization versus
Oh,
nature.
absolutely.
Yeah.
They are all trained for these movie portrayals in all of the movements they make. Whereas in the movie, when the horse is pawing the ground and Randolph Scott looks back at him, all of that is intentional. All of that is set up. All of the horses are trained, have to be vetted before any of the actors can ride those darn things.
Oh.
Because as those of you who have ridden horses and have been thrown from them, that can happen. They don't want that to happen on a movie set.
Yeah. I just had to laugh when I saw that lion there.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, back to our discussion of education. Are there other aspects of Helen's and Beau's education that struck you as significant here in this part of the story?
I think Roseanne was trying to hold up her hand earlier, so
Yeah, Roseanne, go ahead.
Roseanne, go ahead.
Thanks. Well, I was just thinking about when we were talking about Zane Grey, why he included those chapters and his belief in natural versus some spiritual, whatever. I think he had to have gone through in those years between teen and adult, especially some transcription between his father's rigid and I might say cruel beliefs, spiritual, religious beliefs, and what he, Zane Grey, could tolerate in that way. He would never be able to sit through that sort of religious teaching and expectation. That just wasn't who he was. But when he became an adult enough to be out in nature, even as a younger person, he spent a lot of time outdoors in nature, exploring caves, fishing, whatever. All of that, I think, really spoke to him more in terms of spirituality. And I no doubt in my mind that he had to reconfigure his own thinking and figure out what that meant. And his characters then reflected that aspect of his own understanding. I think he was off by a little, but at the same time, that was his accommodation to spirituality, but with that natural bent. That just seems to me the case.
Yeah, I wonder how much Grey was influenced by one of his favorite poets, William Wordsworth, in this philosophy of nature as the source of spirituality. Are you familiar with Wordsworth's poetry? Gray
John.
sometimes quotes it in some of his books.
English major back when, that's been a while ago, like 4 or 5 degrees ago. But yes, so to speak. What I can say though is Zane Grey was much more literary than people give him credit for. He was very much interested in the fine literature. By the way, I was asked once, I was doing a presentation on Gray at a Rotary meeting in Bonita Springs, Florida, and a rather dismissive individual stood up and he said, "Do you call this literature?" That was a do you call this literature? And I quoted Dr. Wheeler on this point, and I said it was the most popular. He was the most popular author of his time, and the reason they called it popular was because more people read him than read Hemingway, for instance, and so on. And I have to say, I got a standing O from everybody in the room, except the question, because I think that was sort of his whole thing, was tearing down these issues. But yes, it wasn't the fine literature of the poets and the great authors and so on, perhaps, but he was a storyteller. And he got his stories from all kinds of places and all kinds of people. And he was a much greater student of all of that, including nature and people and people's ways and so on, than he really ever got credit. And not to mention geography, than he ever got credit for. But we all knew that, of course. I'm just saying that for the record, for the movie.
Yeah, I would argue that this part of the book is what makes this novel a work of literature.
John, I think I made, this is one of my favorite novels, and Gray, I made this point in the past, that Gray is a romantic.
Yeah.
Romantics believe that through communing with nature, one could experience the force, God. And what's so interesting too, that's clear in the novel, that nature is red and tooth and claw. And to have those two positions juxtaposed like that is really surprising, unusual to me. He understood both sides of that thing.
Yeah, I agree with you. And a part of the educational process is that you come up against questions for which there are no answers. There are dilemmas that you can't reconcile, but you've got to hold both of them in your mind. So, he talks about the beauty of nature, and yet he shows how one creature in nature preys on another, and there's blood and guts and pain. And he says, I have no answer for why there is pain. It's just there. It's a part of nature. And you have to understand that, I guess.
Yeah, and John, you just mentioned Wordsworth. You all remember he refers to him in his introduction to The Last Man, and that's probably one of his best introductions to any book. But he refers to Wordsworth there, and he says, "Romance is another name for idealism, and I contend that life without ideals is not worth living."
Yeah. There he specifically quotes some lines from one of Wordsworth's poems. And it's interesting that this question of atavism was in the air in Gray's time, but there were a number of writers who were concerned about the idea of devolution, moving backward into a primitive state. So you had stories like one of Gray's favorite authors, Robert Louis Stevenson. He writes Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, about someone who goes backward into a more primitive state of existence. Or you have Jack London, who talks about Buck the tame dog, who struggles to become a wild dog so he can fulfill his destiny to be what he really is. So that was a topic that was being written about by a lot of writers around the end of the 19th century, early 20th century. So Gray certainly fits into that, it seems to me. Well,
Well,
we're about
that's-
halfway through our session, maybe more. So maybe we ought to look at the second part of the novel and see what comes up there. In this part of the novel, of course, he's creating more of a traditional Western, okay? So what are your thoughts on his Western part of the story, if you will? My dog is reverting here and just becoming wild. Yeah, even though it's a tradition, it seems to me that that last part of the story is really, it has all the Western cliches. But are there any ways in which Gray manages to move away from those cliches and maybe inject a little bit of a different way of presenting a Western story? I'm thinking particularly about the hero, Milton Dale. Is he really involved in the Western action there in the last part of the book? In the traditional Western, what do we expect the hero to do?
less so than Las Vegas.
Yeah, exactly. So here he has the hero sort of on the sidelines of most of the major action of the traditional Western.
But
right?
in a way that allowed more time for Milt to soliloquize.
Yeah. He's actually off stage for most of the second part, isn't he? Most of it.
It's not that unusual in Zane Grey's novels to have a sidekick that does the dirty work.
It's exactly right.
This time as well. Is it the
Yeah.
sidekick? Carmichael, was that his name?
Yeah, Carmichael, yeah.
Novel? He ended up doing
So-
a lot of the dirty work.
Why does he do that, do you think? Why does he keep the hero out of the action, so to speak?
To keep Milt Dale pure,
Yeah, there you go.
keep him
Good thought.
natural.
Well,
If my
Chuck
heart
used
is
to-
pure, I have the strength of 100 men, huh?
Chuck used to
Bob,
Chuck,
what?
Chuck used to call it when I'd talk with him. Chuck used to call it. Meanwhile, back at the ranch.
Yeah. But, why does Gray feel compelled to keep the hero from bloodying his hands, so to speak? I mean, this is not the only novel in which he does this, by the way. Why is that?
I think, it's really to maintain that relationship with Helen. Bo in Las Vegas, or I think his name was actually Tom, as I recall.
Yeah.
The Bo in Las Vegas, they were of the type that, even though he was bloody, if you will, that Bo was going to be able to accept that, where Helen was still maintaining that thinking part, I guess, to a certain extent. And, I don't know if their relationship could have gone any farther if Milt had, turned into a real bloody guy and then killed a bunch of people. So he had to keep
She's
that
too finicky
relationship
to accept.
going.
She's too
Yeah.
finicky to accept a man who's got blood on his hands, huh? Helen is too puritanical to accept a man who's killed.
Yeah, I think she'd become more natural, but not that much.
Uh-huh. Yeah, it seems to me that she reverts back to the helpless damsel in distress in the second part of the book. She hasn't really learned the heritage of the desert. So when difficulties come her way, she just kind of collapses, doesn't she? Or am I wrong?
No, it's more by circumstance. She's forced basically to take refuge while her knight in shining armor takes over and tries to get her property back for her.
Yeah. But isn't she kind of passive here in this part? And then, of course, there's a scene where she is doing everything she can to keep her man from getting involved in violence, even though apparently violence is the only way her problems are going to be solved.
Well, one might raise the question as to what the role of women was in that day.
Yeah.
Not today, but in that day.
Yeah. Well, you could compare her maybe to some of the other heroines in other Gray's novels. In fact, the one that comes right after this, To the Last Man, the heroine at the very end picks up the rifle and blows the bad guy away. It also happened in Wildfire. The heroine there, when her hero who has saved her from the fire is wounded, she has to pick up the rifle and kill the guys who are trying to kill them. So it's not unusual for a gray heroine to show more spunk, I guess you could say, more courage. And
On the other hand, Jane Withersteen wouldn't let Lassiter do what Lassiter had to do.
right,
And if you go back to the first novels, the Frontier trilogy, Betty Zane, Lou Wetzel basically loved her but lost her because he was too bloody.
yeah,
And he self-selected not to pursue, not that he thought he would have won anyway, won her heart, but that was his reason, that he was too bloody for her. And also in The Last Trail, Helen Shepherd wants Jonathan to go after the bad guys who had abducted her. But then when they finally trail into the settlement and he's about ready to kill the guy, she tells him not to do that because she couldn't be with someone who would commit cold-blooded murder.
mhm,
She kind of changed, which confused Jonathan quite a bit, by the way. But
Yeah.
that's kind of a common thing in Gray's novels. And yes, there are the exceptions of those quote unquote damsels who manage their own distress. Thank you very much.
mhm.
Another
Yeah, that's the dilemma of Westerns, the question of violence, when is it ever justified? When is it justified?
And do you want the women to be weak and in distress and therefore have to be rescued? That was a common theme in those times
Yeah.
typically, but today that would be far less acceptable, that the idea that a woman has to be rescued by some man, some knight in shining armor is necessary
Yeah.
for her to survive. I will say, having nothing to do with anything, but it just came up in previous conversation, a point that I would make. I know a lot of Gray's characters would do the soliloquy, and I think that's because he was expressing himself through them. And I think about Wanderer of the Desert and a few other things that to me were just incredibly boring in parts. They just were because of that. Today, and it may be a bad thing to be a writer as well as a reader, because since I became a novelist, a published novelist myself, I find that I critique things I read in a different way. I critique them as a writer would do, or if I wrote them, what would I do with them? It's a very different way of being and reading than it used to be for me. It's less pleasure and more deconstruction, if you will. But one of the things that I think about in my own work, we no longer want the characters soliloquizing in that way. We want them talking with someone. We want action. We want something going on. We want a response to something that's happening on the page. And generally, what I have done is create characters, create opportunities, therefore, for dialogue with somebody, hopefully in an intentional and purposeful sort of way. But we don't just have people talking to themselves or reflecting on things for pages on end. That just doesn't happen today in most novels. I don't know if great literature, what one would say about that. Would have to think about it, but certainly in romance literature, we don't do that.
But that's partly because of the times in which we live. There's far more information or far more educated people in the world today than there were 100 years ago or when Gray was writing this. And I keep thinking back to what you said a minute ago, Roseanne, about women wouldn't accept that role today. And but back then, the frontier was a wild place, and it took wild people to open it up. But once it was opened up, the first thing they did was turn around and try to get women to come out there, because they knew that it needed to be enlarged and expanded and civilized, if you want to call it civilized. But for a while, and this is true, I think today, if there's any places where there is a real frontier even today, it is a wild place, and it takes wild, tough people to open it up.
Well, that's true. There's a book called Soiled Doves, which is exactly what it sounds like. It's a story about the various prostitutes who pioneered their way out to Alaska in the early days of the gold rush there. And they civilized the place, even though they were prostitutes. Once women got on the scene, things changed in ways that would not have been possible without women being on the scene. The same also happened in Quebec in the mid 1600s when Louis the, I guess, 14th decided if he wanted to keep that colony, that area that he had claimed, then there were at that point, I think a little over 3,000 men there, mostly trappers and military. But they weren't going to stay if there were no women. I think there were 44 women there at the time. So
there's a book by, I'm laughing because I can remember the line, but I can't remember exactly the title of the book, but it's a book by Teddy Blue Abbott. And it might be, and maybe someone can help me here, but it might be We Pointed Them North. And at one point, Abbott says, we respected the women. I'm not sure why, but we did.
well, I can explain why, but that's a different phone call.
Yeah.
The bottom line of what I was saying was, if you want to look this up, it's Les Filles de Roy. It was the daughters of the king. So he sent over 500-600 women to marry these men, which reminds me of the movie, if Jim Dark were here, the movie Westward the Women. Similar kind of concept that to keep the men happy, you had to send the women, and the women brought changes. Now sorry, John, we've kind of got off the discussion, but there you have it.
We're running late. We only got about 5 minutes, and I really wanted to ask a couple of other questions. First of all,
like to say
how believable is it that Snake Anson's gang would just fall apart and be afraid of the dark?
I'd like to say a little bit about Jim Wilson. He was kind of the bad guy hero. We haven't talked about him. That was kind of
the anti-hero. Yeah.
He played a very significant role.
Yeah. Well, how believable is it these tough guys would be afraid of the dark?
Jim Wilson was a Texan, wasn't he?
Yeah, and that's another question I have is why does Gray seem to hold Texans and Texas in such high regard?
Yeah, well, he was a Texan, but not only that, he really led to the release of Bo. That plan to release Bo, he was at the heart of that. So he turned to be a good guy.
Yeah. And so what does his being from Texas have to do with that, do you think?
Well, having grown up in Texas, I can tell you, it's all of us are really great people. So that's why he would have done that.
No,
I certainly agree.
But well, Terry, that's true. But why Gray liked Texans so much was because he learned about Texas from guess who? Jim Owens.
Uh-huh.
It's hard not to love Texans.
What are the traits that he seems to admire in Texans? The specific traits.
Gunslingers.
They're gunslingers.
The Texas Rangers.
Yeah. So besides being gunslingers, anything else about them that he seems to admire?
Well, even in the book, Wilson was called a Texas Ranger at the end.
Yeah.
A high regard for women, Texans. That's the code of the West.
Oh, they have a sense of honor, is that right?
Yes.
Could it have been the barbecue?
One other question. I just want to get a quick reaction to you. Is anybody else bothered by the racist language and attitudes in the novel?
Yes, yes, like greasers.
Yeah.
It seemed like the narrator was very down on Mexicans.
Yeah. I mean, they don't talk, they jabber. And of course, they're always shifty and sneaky. And when one of the Mexicans dares put his hand on Helen, he profanes her. What's going on there?
Well, prejudice.
Prejudice.
It's dated, but you know, I don't want to see the book burned as a result of that.
Oh, absolutely
Things
not.
that are going on today.
No, I mean, racism was much more open and accepted in 100 years ago than it is today. So you're right. I mean,
one thing
you don't have to
about,
clean up the past.
one thing about Zane Grey and racist language in his novels, to some extent, he wasn't unlike Mark Twain and Huckleberry Finn.
Oh, yeah.
Look, the narration that Zane Grey uses in discussing racial topics is much more acceptable, especially in terms of the day, than the dialogue that's used, because he was trying to write the dialogue as it would have been spoken in that day. And he was also trying to reflect values as they existed in those days. So that doesn't necessarily mean that he was racist, but he was trying to write accurately. Not saying
Yeah, but the way he describes the Mexican characters, this is the author talking, and he talks about them being sort of less than human. I mean, they jabber, they don't talk with their beautiful language. And just the fact that a Mexican would dare touch a white woman is considered a profane act. You know, that's what bothers me.
Not in that day. No, not in that day. I think that he was reflecting the beliefs relative to racism of that particular day. Today,
oh, I agree with that. Yeah,
they're inappropriate, but
yeah,
to a certain extent, recognizing that language for what it is part of the education of reading Grey and other novels.
I agree, and I certainly would not want it to be censored or changed in any way. But it is, for me, it's a problematical part of reading the book.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting that even Beasley was, you know, kind of downgraded because he was supposedly part Mexican.
Yeah, yeah. That makes him less human, I guess.
Yeah, I'm not going to burn the book, Alan.
No.
If you look at Light of Western Stars, one of my other favorites, he does a lot of that same thing in there. And if you read Joe's keynote, I think it was from 2015 at Mormon Lake, he does a beautiful job of explaining that the very subject, actually. And remember, it was also the time in which Grey lived, and there was a lot of obvious prejudice. By the way, Grey, that's why I'm editing to a contemporary edition. I have, in fact, finished this, edited the Frontier Trilogy books, the first three, into a contemporary edition, which erases all of that language, and because he actually uses the N word.
Yeah.
In Betty, at least. And so that was reflective of the times in 1903, not a problem then, problem now. And I want to get these books on the shelves of libraries. So I have done that. And also things like Savage, Red Man, we don't say that anymore. So those things literally could be scrubbed.
But you know, one of the things is you got to take people in their time, in their times. He was writing about them in their time.
Exactly, in their time. The context. That's
what he was doing. And so, you know, now we got this politically correct baloney that we can't look back at the times as they were. They've got to be as we want them to be.
Yeah, well, I think you're absolutely right.
Ridiculous.
Hey, John, before we run out of time, I wanted to call attention to the conclusion of this novel, which I think is absolutely fabulous. We're sitting there on a stone that fell down thousands of years ago, looking up into the nighttime sky, and everything seems to be clear and copacetic and beautiful. It's a fabulous conclusion.
I agree.
Yeah, I agree.
I absolutely agree.
Oh, yeah. One other thing before we conclude, the Mormons, the 4 Mormon boys are the heroes in this story. This is
Yeah.
1918. So he's gone a long way to make them, he continually talks about them as the heroes.
Yeah.
Yeah, one
Yeah,
of them
Roy
is a
Beeman
polygamist.
is a polygamist, and
Yeah.
he's quite
And
a heroic
polygamist,
character.
yeah.
You know,
It's novel.
maybe everybody knows this, but this book was the bestseller in 1920, according to Publisher Weekly.
Yeah.
There's one question I have. You're talking about at the end of the book, when Milt and Helen get married, and the Mormon preacher, he says a prayer. Have you read that prayer? He starts out by saying, "There is only one God, and Him I beseech," and he goes on to talk about how the man should have sons and to grow up strong and be in the woods and so forth and make them like him. Then he goes on and talks about Helen to have the daughters and bless the daughters of the women and send them more of her love and soul. So it's a really deep prayer. And I just can't figure out where he got that prayer. If you read that and read that so deep, did he come up with that? Did he?
Yeah, it's on page 379, in case you want to look it up.
Yeah, and it's, I just can't believe where he got that prayer. If
You're wondering if Gray wrote that prayer, or did he
right,
copy it from somewhere?
Right.
Yeah. I don't know. I would tend to give credit to Gray, but I don't have any proof.
Yeah, but it's a deep. But if that goes further about the earlier discussion about the religion and about God, because in that first sentence there's only one God, so that goes back to his spiritual, religious aspect.
Well, the concepts are consistent with the Latter-day Saint theology, but the language and the way it was presented certainly isn't. A Latter-day Saint prayer would be full of these and thys and all of those activities. So to me, that's Zane Grey expressing his perspective, similar, by the way, to the perspective in The Vanishing American, which is also, by the way, similar to the conclusions at the end of this novel and the description of Rainbow Arch in The Vanishing American. Very similar in concept.
Okay, well, I hate to break this up. This is getting pretty deep, or has been getting pretty deep, but we need to go ahead and close this one down, and then we'll get back on to the next Zoom session with Todd, and we're going to talk collecting Zane Grey. But John, thank you so much for hosting this and running everything. Yeah, everybody give him a hand.
Thank you.
There, so thank you so much for doing it. And let me thank all of you for joining us. I know this is a little bit of a hassle getting on here, but it's just wonderful seeing everybody. I wish we could see everybody in person. So it's a shame we can't do that. So good enough. Let's drop off. And John, you want to make a conclusion?
Can I just have?
Let you know, Terry.
Hi, David.
Hello there.
So long, everyone.
It's the middle of the night here where I am, and I've got my dressing gown on, and I've got out of bed for this.
All right. Very good. We'll see you guys at the next session here in just a second.
Yep.
Bye-bye.